Hey there! Welcome to my series on reviewing and ranking the main numbered Final Fantasy games against each other. Without further ado, let's get started. Final Fantasy XI released in 2002 and was the first dip the series took into the MMO genre. This is pre-World of Warcraft, and was positioned to rival EverQuest. It also released on the PS2 as well as the PC, requiring the installation of a hard drive to the back of the console. Unfortunately, support for the console versions has long since ceased, so PC is the only option these days. But the fact that an MMO was available on console in the early 2000s is bonkers. Of course, the major appeal of the game, even at the time, was being able to immerse yourself in the Final Fantasy world with your friends in a multiplayer environment. The game is old school in its design in a lot of aspects, although namely in its quest design. There have been tons of updates over the 18 years the game has been out, with several expansions both big and small. Oh, and the game still has a subscription. $8.99 a month with one character, with each additional character costing an extra 80 pence or so. Kinda crazy to be honest, but I feel that having the subscription stops the game from being riddled with free-to-play garbage that would alter the way it plays, probably driving away the people that still play it for good. Graphically, Final Fantasy XI looks like the PS2 game it is. It's a significant step down from Final Fantasy X, but that's to be expected with this being an MMO. However, it does still look pretty grimy in places. Namely, the caves and fields can be pretty flatly textured. I think what hasn't helped the graphics age too well is that, at least in the initial areas the game starts with, the art style seems to be going for an at-the-time realistic aesthetic. There's fantastical elements to the environments, yes, however for the most part the style and colour schemes skew towards realism. This mostly leaves the areas feeling dull due to the colour palette, with a lot of brown and grey hues dominating the landscapes. It doesn't look bad by any stretch, but looks rather mundane compared to other areas in the series. The realistic aesthetic doesn't mean that the monster designs are bad though. A lot of them are reused in Final Fantasy XIV too, as they're rather iconic looking beasts. Mostly the look of the ghost-like enemies, the goblins, the goobus, and the pugils to name but a few. All the characters in the game take on the visual fidelity kind of close to the incidental NPCs found in Final Fantasy X. Again, this is due to being a purely multiplayer game, but it doesn't look bad. If anything, it helps create a more consistent look for the experience, with no visual whiplash of having a high quality main character standing next to a no-name incidental character. I think the visual aspect that holds up well, however, is the particle effects from spells and abilities. These are the effects which help provide the impact from using them. This aspect of visual design has honestly been one of Square's strong suits for a long time in the series. They do a lot of the legwork to make the visuals of the game interesting. Although, despite my complaints about the boring looking environments, this is remedied somewhat as the expansions go on. As early as the very first expansion, we enter a more natural looking environment that better plays to the strengths of the game's engine. The forest explored at the start of the Rise of the Zilart expansion was a massive breath of fresh air for me. It was a shame when I got guided into another samey dungeon surrounded by grey walls though. Combat in Final Fantasy XI is certainly indicative of its age as an MMO. Final Fantasy XI is a very menu-driven game in general. Everything is dug beneath pages of text in small windows. Combat is no different. When you've selected an enemy to attack, you choose the option to initiate auto-attacking. As you hit the enemy, you build up a TP gauge, or technique points. When you reach 1,000 or more TP, you can use a weapon skill. These are learned based on whichever weapon you're using, and you gain more as you level up and increase the skill with that weapon type. Although the game doesn't make it obvious when you've learned a new skill, you'll just notice it there when you go to select a weapon skill sometimes. Either way, using the weapon skill will, most of the time, do a burst of damage. However, something that's barely explained by the game at all is the skill chain system. Getting to grips with this is how the endgame is won. You'll notice that at the end of the description of each skill, it says something like skill chain impaction. Is it ever explained what the hell this means? Nope. The basic gist though is that if two characters use skill chains that combo off each other within a few seconds apart, it will cause a burst of damage. There's a similar system for Magic too, but I didn't really look into it much. Sounds pretty simple really. However, I have no idea which abilities other characters use which I can chain off or into. There's this chart which supposedly makes it easier to understand, but yeah, this isn't helping. It's a system that works fine if playing with other characters and arranging abilities to be used, which I suppose goes to show how much this game was designed for the multiplayer aspect first and foremost. It's not a bad combat system really, it works for what it's designed to do, and for a pre-WoW MMO, it's incredibly flashy and enjoyable. I think part of what makes it a chore for solo players is the trusts. The trust system is a way to remedy the dwindling low-level player base, by allowing you to summon NPC helpers in defeating the monsters and dangerous fauna of Vana'diel. The problem is that their AI leaves something to be desired at times, and they can make combat a pain. So one stumbling block I came upon was a boss fight against 3 Tomberries. I was finding it supremely difficult with trusts, as they only attack the target you're currently on, which means that my tank trust wouldn't reliably grab the aggro of all 3 Tomberries without me attacking them one by one, which left me open to getting nuked by the Black Mage Tomberry, or just getting stabbed to death. Again, if I was playing with a group of real people, this may have been challenging but far from impossible, like I felt it was with trusts. I out-leveled it to beat it, leveling being the trust's main purpose really. But it really took the wind out of my sails, to be honest. One of my favourite aspects of the combat system though, is the way classes, or jobs, are integrated. You choose your starting job at the start of the game: warrior, monk, thief, red mage, white mage, or black mage. If you're familiar with the series, these jobs need little introduction. They fit the main archetypes for an MMO of tank, damage dealers, and healers. However, what makes Final Fantasy XI unique, and helps give it that FF magic, is that you unlock the ability to take another job as a sub-job. This means that you retain half the level of the sub-job, but have all the benefits that it would have given you. So, I started as a thief, and to supplement my abilities, I chose to unlock and level up a dancer job too. I leveled it to 50, the same as I'd got my thief to, and so I ran with a thief main job, with Dancer as well functioning at level 25. This meant I could make full use of the Thief toolkit, while also having access to the sneak skills and a bit of the magic-free healing that Dancer has access to at level 25. I like this a lot, and while there's obviously the meta job combos that are all but required in endgame content, it also leaves room for player expression, a strength carried over from where the idea originates in Final Fantasy V. The quest design is indicative of the older MMO design philosophies of the pre-WoW era. There are no icons to tell you which NPCs have quests, no quest markers, no journal to track side quests and the like, and little in terms of guidance with getting started really. There are characters you can speak to which help you learn the ropes a little bit, and they push you towards the quests for your starter nation. There's a newer mechanic to learn too, one that was introduced later in the game's lifecycle: Records of Eminence. This is a way to earn extra items and experience by completing tasks such as clearing missions, killing a certain amount of enemies in an area, or unlocking certain features. This is probably the best method of introducing yourself to the various content found in Vana'diel, without outside help, although often they can be just as vague as anything else in the game. The vagueness of the structure is supposed to encourage exploration, leading you to learning the maps and locations of items much more vividly. And this is certainly what happens in some cases. I completed the Magicite quest on this character while barely looking at a guide for it, as I just remembered from when I did it before. However, for most people who just want to see the content, or more importantly, engage with the story, this is an exercise in frustration. Story is locked behind doing inane quests that boil down to overly long fetch quests. After level 50, these are taken to the extreme when you have to hunt for trinkets hidden within laborious labyrinths, just to unlock that ability to level up another 5 times. Without a guide, I imagine these quests are beyond tedious, as the places you have to search are small invisible spots labelled with 3 question marks. If you have no idea where these could specifically be, I can only theorise on the frustration of hunting through the halls of caves and ruins for them. What I think this is supposed to accomplish is probably what it did at release: create a sense of community. If everyone is at the same point and are at the same progression gates, well then, you have thousands of people at once searching for the same thing and collectively figuring out solutions to the issues the game provides. The wiki guides have basically replaced this aspect of the game in a way at this point. The mechanics are figured out and laid bare upon the canvas of the wiki. Any question you may have, answered. And I'm thankful for it. If it wasn't for the wealth of information available, I don't think I would get anywhere close to as far as I got. And this is my major gripe with this game: it doesn't respect your time at all. Obviously, it's an MMO, so wasting time is par for the course, but hours of my playtime was spent on traversing feature-starved zones that took tens of minutes to get from one side to the other, or spent in dungeons that go on for far longer than is fun. I get that a lot of this is to sell the scale of the world, and it does that. However, I feel that it tips the scales over to tedium. This is coming from a solo player, however. These issues for me can be easily remedied by simply sharing the experience with friends. That's honestly what makes multiplayer games like this special, as you get to share the experience with others. I really wish that I could have played this with other people I know, but I couldn't possibly convince anyone I know to give it a go. And the dwindling player base, while still impressively large, has little interest in doing low-level content. Occasionally I would run into other players in the dungeons doing their own thing, but they're all running solo too, clearly not intending to group up. So you're left to mostly fend for yourself in this world designed to be played and experienced with others, which is a shame. I think this is honestly shown by listening to people discuss about their time with the game when it released. They often look back on it fondly, even if they were becoming obsessed with it to the point of damaging their health. A great video I found on this is by Happy Console Gamer, whose video I'll link down below. His tale with the game isn't an overly positive one, but it's interesting to hear him talk about actually playing the game and how much he enjoyed himself. I got a small taste of what it could be like to play this game with friends when I briefly streamed it onto Twitch. Discussing the game and talking about it as I played helped alleviate the tedium of the game a lot, and I wasn't even playing directly with these people. I was just hanging out. A lot of people that are still in the game are just standing around the main cities, so I think for a lot of them, they just enjoy being in Vana'diel and hanging out, talking to their friends in the clans and occasionally doing endgame content with them. I was enjoying exploring Vana'diel myself, however the adventures it provided me as a solo player left me wanting. It's a shame the gameplay left me with little motivation to continue too far into the game, as the story of Final Fantasy XI is pretty good. It doesn't really start out that way, of course, as the world has to introduce itself first. The starter quests of the nations are usually rather mundane, but often link into local problems and hint at things to come. This is supplemented by the addition of the Rhapsodies of Vana'diel questline. This is mostly intended as the end of the Final Fantasy XI story. However, it starts in an intriguing manner and weaves into the main scenario relatively seamlessly. So the story of ROV will take you on its own path for a little while, introducing you to Iroha, who hails from the future and knows of you as a master, coming back in time to stop a darkness from taking over Vana'diel. She hints at what awaits them in the future, and urges a cast of characters to help change it. The characters that are involved aren't really introduced much. I felt like I should have already met these guys. Still though, the ROV story sparked my interest and I pushed on with it, following it to where it stops you from progressing before you deal with the quest from your starting nation. I honestly suggest doing this too if you ever play this game, as the questline rewards buffs to skill and EXP gains, as well as the ability to summon more trusts at once. Very useful stuff. Over the course of ROV, more characters from the main story are implemented, again with little fanfare, introducing Lion and Zide. These guys are pretty important to the story in the nation missions, and are involved directly with taking down the Shadow Lord. And so, with a glimpse of the dark future ahead of Vana'diel, I set my sights on the nation missions in order to take down the Shadow Lord and his Beastmen forces. Honestly, the first half of the nation missions are kinda boring. The tensions between the Beastmen and the nations are building, with attacks on the cities becoming more and more frequent. As the second half of the story is ushered in though, and the setting is moved more towards Juno, things start getting a bit more interesting. It soon becomes clear that the Beastmen are trying to summon the Shadow Lord from his 20-year slumber. However, we learn that their reasoning may not be of some unknowable evil, but more due to desperation, with the homes being invaded and pillaged by the Free Nations. It's completely understandable that they'd be angry enough to summon the Harbinger of Doom. They plan to do so with the power of Magicite, which the totally not evil why did you even think that Archduke of Juno tasks you with finding. Over the course of finding these crystals, you have visions of a time past when representatives of the Free Nations went on an expedition in the Northlands. There, a human named Aurich took it upon himself to kill one of his fellow musketeers, Raogrim, due to his empathy with the plight of the Beastmen and jealousy over having won Cornelia's love. Cornelia was another musketeer who was also on the expedition, and took a blow for Raogrim to protect him from Aurich, only to be killed in the process. Being left for dead by Aurich, Raogrim passed with anger and vengeance in his heart, and as such became reborn as the Shadow Lord. This is all pretty intriguing in the game. I'm not sure if this is due to the very minimal story that came beforehand, or if it's genuinely compelling. I'm also probably not doing it a great deal of justice here. However, these late reveals in the plot and the various bits of world building found within the cutscenes really helped immerse myself in the world of Vana'diel, and I wanted to see where else the story would go. The nation missions finished strongly. The follow-up expansion, Rise of the Zilart, also is really fascinating from what I saw of it. It follows on directly from the ending of the base game story, and has the reveal that, shock horror, the Archduke was a Zilart, something you've heard about very briefly in the story. They're the people that came before, little seemingly known about them. However, I didn't get too much further than this into the story. After the encounter with the Tomberry boss I mentioned before, and with the story of ROZ becoming a massive improvement from what I'd seen of it, I ended up being told to collect gems from 7 places across the land. I got one of them, but the process of getting it was so dull I decided to give up on it. First of all, I have no idea how to figure out where these would be without a guide, And secondly, the act of getting just a single gem I needed involved a trek through a cave system that took tens of minutes. Tens! And that was with me being able to sneak past or ignore most of the enemies found within. If a quest like this was put in so early into the story, then I can only imagine how it would go further down the road. It's a shame, as I was genuinely looking forward to seeing more of the story as I just got into it properly. However, the uninviting quest design turned me off really hard, and that's incredibly disappointing. One of the most defining features of the Final Fantasy series is a reputation for having excellent music, and Final Fantasy XI is no outlier in that trend. Series composer Nobuo Uematsu provided a few tracks for the OST, but the majority is held by Naoshi Mizuta and Kumi Tanioka, Mizuta going on to be the game's main composer over the various expansions. Some highlights for me include Runfa, Battle in the Dungeon, Sorrow, The Republic of Bastok, Awakening, Kazam, Battle in Dungeon 3, and Graviton. So, to conclude, I don't think Final Fantasy XI is a bad game by any stretch, more that it's unashamedly a product of its time. Its focus and story makes it unique even amongst its most direct competition, and more importantly, justifies its Final Fantasy name. While I found the quest design to be painful and far too opaque in places, the presentation of it soars it far above that seen in classic World of Warcraft's tiresome kill X amount of Y quests. So I suppose this leaves me with figuring out where I would put this on my list. For most people, I would not recommend playing this game unless you have a bunch of mates to play it with, and of course the monthly fee can be off-putting for many people, especially as it seems less and less justified as time goes on. However, if you've made it this far into the video and thought, Dan, how can you say this game isn't that great when everything you've mentioned sounds awesome and a breath of fresh air? Well then friend, this game may be right up your alley. It's an acquired taste for sure, but as for my own personal list, I'm tempted to put it right at the bottom, below 2, as I couldn't put myself through all the content on offer, as I at least finished 2, which I think is what I'll do. So the list is as follows. 1. Final Fantasy 9, 2. Final Fantasy 6, 3. Final Fantasy 10, 4. Final Fantasy 7, 5. Final Fantasy 5, 6. Final Fantasy 8, 7. Final Fantasy 4, 8. Final Fantasy 1, 9. Final Fantasy 3, 10. Final Fantasy 2, and 11. Final Fantasy 11. While I bounced off 11 completely, I still can't call it a bad game. I hope I've made it clear why I found it personally frustrating, while showing what I liked about it too. I genuinely think it's still pretty good for the right person, just that person isn't me. However, I can still respect it from afar, and glad I gave this entry of the series an honest shot. I think if I played this title at the time, I'd be one of the masses AFKing in Juno right about now. Thanks for watching.